that basically began to feed my curiosity as I went on through high school. And of course, I'm growing up, in the civil rights era. Martin Luther King is assassinated on, my sister's 10th birthday. In fact, before that, I'm sitting in assembly and John F. Kennedy is assassinated, while we're there. So many things were happening that my parents really gave no explanation to other than go to school, pay attention to this. You got to do assignments. You got to do this and that. And so that's where curiosity was. There was lots of things going on and there were no answers to my questions.
Welcome to Unpacked Culture Chronicles. I'm Danielle Marshall, an equity strategist and executive coach, and I'm thrilled to have you here. This podcast is all about exploring cultural differences, similarities, and the ways that we can begin to bridge across them. Together, we're going to dive into meaningful conversations with guests from all walks of life. We'll share stories, insights, and practical strategies for navigating the complexity of culture in our workplaces, communities, and personal lives. Some people live one life at a time. And then there's Mustafa Ahmed, musician, social worker, world traveler, and family friend. And he's lived a rhythm-filled life that bridges cultures, communities, and generations. And today we're unpacking how all of those experiences has shaped the way he sees the world and himself. So Mustafa, I'm so excited to be able to welcome you to the show. Thank you so much for joining us today.
And thank you for giving me this opportunity to tell a little bit about my sort of complicated story.
Absolutely. And so because you have a wonderful story to tell, I always like to invite our guests to just start us off by sharing a little bit more about your background and where life finds you today.
Well, Danny, one of the things is I've had an opportunity to watch some of your other podcasts, and they've been very interesting. Of course, I never imagined that I would be here because they're all younger than me. The fact of the matter is I'm 73 years old. And so, again, things are weird. For about 40 years, from the time I was in my early 20s, I worked in social services. I was a community organizer, a street gang worker. I worked with children and parents in foster care. I did job development, a lot of community organization. Basically, from the time I was in my very early teens, I was always concerned about the conditions of Black folk and poor folk, uh, especially since I grew up in an integrated community uh, where I grew up with many white friends of all different religions, et cetera, and did not, again, have any understanding of the complexity of things like culture until a little bit later in my teens. And so I had all these different jobs. I was always curious about people. And I did 40 years of so-called legitimate work while at the same time pursuing a career in music. Having never had any formal music education, I just liked what musicians were, growing up in the Motown era. And God was good to me. As a result of me being curious and asking a lot of questions, I was able to successfully have a career in both the social services world and in the music industry.
Okay. So thank you for sort of laying a little bit about that out. And I love that you are getting into this idea that you are one of my older guests. And we welcome that here because we really do want a diversity of perspectives. And so that diversity extends to career paths that people have taken, their specific identities, their age, their gender, et cetera. And so I really am curious about a lot of things related to your both experiences in life, but also your take as someone of the age that you are. And so you've mentioned already that you've had this large range of experiences, whether, again, we're talking about social services to music to international travel. And something that I was really curious to lean into is what did eventually shape your ability to recognize and then maybe even navigate cultural norms when you were in these various spaces because they look different everywhere?
These things actually began in my very, very early teens. Back in the early 1960s, things were very different than they are now. I was fortunate. I don't know if folks, and again, I'm going to mention some names and I'm going to ask the audience because, again, these names are people who are very prominent in the tapestry of American life uh, during these past, 50 years that we may not know. I'm going to mention first the name of Gil Noble. Gil Noble was an African American reporter who had a show called Like It Is, and it was on ABC, and it was all about Black history. And what's mind blowing was that his mother, Iris Noble, was a director of the community center where I grew up. And somehow or another, again, fortunately, I got to work under her. Why? Because back in those days, we had something known as Neighborhood Youth Corps. The government provided a certain amount of money to various localities to employ teenagers during the summer months. And it seemed that because of the fact that I was good in school academically, always at the top of the class, that I always was chosen for some of these jobs. And I got to work in the community center and was given position, as like the junior counselor. There was an older person and then there was me. And there is where I began to develop a curiosity, how to be a good leader, what that meant, particularly because, the other children in the particular center were not always from my neighborhood. One of the things I also need to point out from a cultural point of view was back in the early 1960s, there was something known as released time. I was brought up in a Roman Catholic family. My stepfather was a, a Cuban, a dark-skinned Cuban, who was here, and they were very strict Catholics. And during my time in elementary school, and we're talking about, again, I was born in 1952, so we're talking about 1960, 1961, all the children who were Roman Catholic and went to the church that I went to, Holy Cross Church, were taken every Tuesday, separated from the rest of the students, and were marched through the streets. They were taken out of their classroom and they were marched 10, 15 blocks to the local church, Holy Cross Church, for Christian instruction. So from the time that, again, I was, 7, 8 years old and I'm in school, I'm curious about why I'm going and other classmates are not going. Of course, at that time, I didn't get any particular answers. So basically, what I'm saying is that from the time I was in elementary school and during the time that I first began to develop work experience in, the community center working with younger children, I began to understand the differences that I was able to identify, notice that there were certain differences in what some people did and what some people didn't do. And that basically began to feed my curiosity as I went on, uh, through high school. And of course, I'm growing up, in the civil rights era. Martin Luther King is assassinated on, my sister's 10th birthday. In fact, before that, I'm sitting in assembly and John F. Kennedy is assassinated, right there on, you know, while we're there. So many things were happening that my parents really gave no explanation to other than go to school, pay attention to this, you got to do assignments, you got to do this and that. And so that's where curiosity was. There was lots of things going on and there were no questions. There were
Yeah.
no answers to my questions.
Yeah, so I think something that you're bringing up, and I would definitely say this is a shift in sort of where we are today, is that you were able, even as a young person, to notice some of these things were different, right? Didn't ascribe necessarily a meaning to them yourself. You had that curiosity, but answers were not forthcoming from the adults in your life, is what it sounds like. Um,
Hmm.
and compare that to sort of where we sit today with our kids that ask
Um,
all kinds of questions. And we talk a lot about cultures, in terms of similarities and differences, but it sounds
oh
very
boy.
much like that was not present for you as a young person. Why are we moving in different ways? And it doesn't seem like people had answers for you. And I juxtapose that with today's kids who very much get to talk about culture, cultural similarities, differences on a regular basis,
Yes, yes,
and it's very open, ended, and anybody can sort of launch into that conversation, so, like, that feels like a major shift from when you were initially growing.
yes.
Yeah,
Very much so. I would agree with your assessment. I hadn't thought about it that way, but definitely.
yeah. And I'm curious because you were talking a little bit before about the work, that you did in social work programs, and I'm wondering, like, again, as we're talking about, like, how things have shifted over time, I'm curious about how you approach that work differently, as you were working with parents, people that, kids that might have come from different cultural backgrounds. What did that look like for you at the time?
Well, once again, one of the differences, particularly, in this particular administration, where it seems that the mood is to have a more limited government. My early work experience was in the age right out of Lyndon Baines Johnson and his Great Society, along with Adam Clayton Powell and all of these different anti-poverty programs. And so my work experience and how I ended up getting all of these different situations. So, for example, you had these different programs or government programs like the Manpower Career Development Act, MCDA, CETA, the Comprehensive Employment and Training Act, and there were other initiatives. And what happened is that the government would put out RFPs, requests for proposals, and
Okay.
various community organizations, including the cities and states, basically it would try to develop programs that they would submit to the particular government agencies in order to get down those funds and address the issues that the government was doing. Lo and behold, believe it or not, uh, because of I was a community activist, at a very early age, I was appointed to the community planning board, and by the first Jewish borough president of the Bronx, Bob Abrams, and I got to sit, around adults who were discussing these various programs. And when various issues came out, I guess in my youth, I just had great ideas. I felt free to just kind of throw stuff out. Uh, and people were fascinated. And it also helped that they would tell me, that those folks who wanted to be dismissive to the young person would say, well, why don't you write it down? Little did they know that I was a top ranked student, writer, etc. And I would go and I would write these proposals, answers, and I would get a job. I would get a job. So for example, uh, my very first serious job for the city was with the Youth Board Research Institute. I had gone to Tanzania. I'd left, college after my second year at NYU. And when I came back, I realized I really wasn't interested in going back to school and I wanted to get a job. And I went back to the community center first, where Iris Noble was. And she said, listen, we have this issue that the city is trying to deal with. At the time, a Republican mayor, John Lindsay, was the mayor. And we were beginning to see an influx of violent street gangs. And because, of my, politics, young black militant, so to speak, and having gone to East Africa and participating in Pan African skills and that stuff, they said, wow, maybe this is a job for you. And I was very curious about what that was. So my first job is a street gang worker. And I basically walked the streets at night and wrote reports about my conversations with Black and Latino kids who were in the Savage Nomads and the Black Spades and the Ghetto Brothers with conflicts that they had with white Italian kids in adjoining projects. And somehow or another, back and forth, I was able to create certain situations, like just simple things like let's have a party, let's have a conference, let's have a street fair that basically got these various teenagers to have some degree of peace, etc., some degree of calmness. And those ideas, things I did, became institutionalized in the local community centers at Bronx River, Soundview, James Monroe. And then what happens? I'm approached by another older person in the community who says, "Listen, I have this issue. I have this issue. Can you help me with it?" In other words, I'm sort of trying, they sort of co-opting me. And so I ended up, working for this person and that person and that person. And I was lucky enough at one point to be hired uh, to basically bring a number of organizations together by the United Neighborhood Houses of New York. The settlement house movement in New York City was significant in dealing with immigrant communities since the very early 1900s. And I was hired to do something known as the Bronx Youth Service System. And that was to get various community organizations to come together while developing youth councils where one had to solicit young people's ideas. So again, it's all about curiosity. Let's ask young people questions. What's on your mind? What do we think that needs to happen, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That was a successful program. I ended up counseling, Africa Mbata. That he was Lance Taylor at the time, and again, I got him and stuff with my wife, and bingo.
Well, here's the thing, right? Like I am very interested in practical application for people. And if you look at the world that we are living in right now, things are tense. They are polarized. We have people that are butting heads every which way they turn at this point. And so because you were able to navigate at that point in time across cultures, in different communities, kids who were quite frankly troubled in a lot of cases, what advice would you offer to this audience in terms of like how they might begin to bridge across some divides that they are experiencing?
The key is ask questions. Have an open heart. More importantly, have an open mind. Because these issues that we have go on since the beginning of time. We didn't start them. You know what I'm saying? Whatever you read in terms of history, history is going on for hundreds and thousands of years. And you can go back to the earliest points in time in history and find that there were conflicts.
Sure.
Somehow or another, again, based upon my childhood, I found that when I started asking questions, that the responses that I got gave some solace. They gave me, some hope, some sense of security. It's like, oh, I got that. I understand that. It's when there was a sense of uncertainty. Like, what does that mean for me? Am I safe?
Mm,
Do I threaten you? When those questions were unresolved, there was tension, there was conflict. However, when I felt I was able to explain to others where I was coming from and they were at peace, and when I was able to ask them questions and they answered them, I felt at peace, and conflicts were limited, were much limited, at least in my mind and my spirit. And that's basically what I did when I was working. That when I went out to do jobs, when I was hired by an organization, or when I was first interviewed, I would ask them questions. What do you expect? What about the people in the neighborhood? What are they going to think about me? What kind of support will I get? And then when I went out into the community, I didn't come with the agency. The agency has some ideas, but we need to know how to serve you. How
yeah.
can we do this? What do you need? Okay.
Yeah.
What have
I'm
we done? What have we done in the past that made you uncomfortable?
yeah, I'm
Ask
I'm
questions.
appreciating sort of that approach to it because I think that's very much how I approach the landscape today. instead of just coming to people with sort of this if you build it they will come mentality, is to actually engage people and figure out like what do you value, what is meaningful to you, what
Yes.
would you like to look different. Because I have found in terms of bridging across difference that we may, have different things that we want at the end of the day, but there's generally some kind of thread in there that is a similarity that we want.
Yes.
What
Yes.
feels
Yes.
often different is we don't necessarily agree with how to get there, but I'm like, we can work on those details, but can we find the thing that is meaningful to people? And the only way we can find out what is meaningful to people is to actually engage with them, right? Talk to
Yeah.
them, observe their community, like be not as an outsider, but like be part of it and really get sincere responses from people. So I
Yes.
definitely appreciate that. This episode of Unpacked Culture Chronicles is brought to you by Culture Principles, a coaching and consulting practice helping people build real inclusion from the inside out. Because inclusion isn't just about policies, it's also about our people. And while strong policies matter, it's cultural awareness that brings them to life. Our cultural competency coaching program supports leaders, team members, and change makers alike in showing up with greater clarity, confidence, and care. To learn more, visit us at culture-principles.com/coaching. We'd love to work with you. So I want to pivot the conversation a little bit because I want to talk about your music journey, right? Your work in the music world offers a completely different layer to your cultural journey. And I'm just curious again what that experience is like, what it taught you along the way.
Well, once again, as I mentioned earlier, I just always loved music, and actually, I love drumming. But the fact of the matter is that my mother had a stroke when she was 10 years old. When I was 10 years old, and although she recovered, there was this constant vibe in the house. Am I 11, 12, 13 years old? I always wanted drums for my birthday or for Christmas, and I couldn't get them because my dad would tell me, "Well, we don't want to have too much noise in the house because your mother. We don't want to your mother get sick again." And so that was something that we just kept inside of me. And then, of course, we have the beginning of the African American Renaissance in terms of culturally. So we start hearing, Olatunji, and we start hearing kunga drums and so forth, and a lot of the popular, music, etc. And there's also again uh, the heightening of Latin music, salsa, in that particular time as the Puerto Rican community and the Cuban community now, coming to the United States as a result of the Castro uh, issue, with the United States politically. So we're hearing a lot of that. And so when I was at college, at NYU, there were guys who were doing the drums. And so I got into playing the drums. And so I kind of like, self taught myself. I had some really great experiences where, again, I sort of got pretty good before I thought that I was pretty good. And I got asked to play with a gentleman named James Mason. I want everybody again to Google this name, James Mason, and this album, which is one of the seminal uh, R&B albums of our time, although it was not a big hit, but underground, it's a big thing. And the album was called Rhythm of Life. What was important about this was that Rhythm of Life was recorded at a studio called Downtown Sound on Christopher Street. And although I didn't know the significance of it at the time, the studio was right around the corner from the Stonewall Bar, which was the epicenter of the gay rights movement.
Hmm.
Now, why is that significant? Oh, the music is great. But one night, let me explain, in the studio, you have an area where the musicians are recording. And then you have another room where the engineers are, the people who are doing the recording, the technicians. And then there's another room, uh, which is the lounge, where the guests
Okay.
are the musicians or the musicians go out. And after one recording session, I come out and I, spend some night and I go to the lounge. And this gentleman named Arthur Russell comes up to me and says, listen, you're Mustafa, you're the conga player. Wow, I really like you, really like you. My name is Arthur Russell. I'm originally from Iowa, but I've recently been in San Francisco. I play cello. I played cello, and I would really like you to play with me. Yeah, I'm curious. It's like, wait a minute, this don't make any sense. What would a young guy from Iowa playing cello want to do with me, a black cat from the Bronx, New York, playing conga drums? Made no sense. But I was curious. I had to follow because I was also humble. It's like I didn't think I was all that good. So again, to make a long story short, I ended up doing a lots of different records with Arthur. It's an unbelievable musical experience. It's very different than anything that I had done before. But while I'm with Arthur, I also meet three people who to this day are extremely consequential. These are members of Arthur's band. Peter Zumo, Elodie Loughton, and Peter Gordon. All white. Okay, so let me say that. Peter Zumo plays the trombone. What Peter Zumo want to do with Mustafa? Elodie Loughton, she's playing this classical music. What Elodie Loughton want to have to do with Mustafa? Peter Gordon, well, he was more like a big band thing. But one of the things is that I learned with Arthur and being in his group was that the groups were democratic. Let me explain that. Elodie, Arthur, and Peter, the two people, they all played together through Arthur. That's how I met them. But when Peter Zumo had a project or Elodie had a project, the other members all went and played on their projects the way they wanted to do music. It was very, very interesting. Most importantly, several years, I'm friends with Arthur now for 6, 7 years. And we end up going to work on a project in Minneapolis of Peter Zumo's with another great artist, Trisha Brown. And at that time, Arthur and I were working on this recording called Let's Go Swimming. And we were having a hard time finding time to finish it. And so I assumed that while we were in Minneapolis, during the downtime, Arthur and I would be able to get together. And I couldn't find Arthur during any of the downtime, the first 2 or 3 days. And I went to Peter Zumo and I said, yo, Peter, like, what's up? Where's Arthur? And he looks at me and it's like, Mustafa, don't you know that Arthur is with this male dancer? Arthur's gay. And I'm trying to process that. And I go to my room and you know what? My head explodes. All this time growing up, I had this perception that a gay man was effeminate, that he had certain characteristics, that a gay woman was masculine and had certain characteristics. And here I understood that my stereotype of what a gay man was totally and completely wrong. My head exploded. And I said to myself right after that, if my stereotype of gay people could be so completely wrong, then perhaps the stereotypes that some white folk have about black folk could be totally different if they know me, if they have a relationship with me. changed my life.
I'm appreciating the story that you just shared because I think one of the challenges that we are very much facing right now as a society is that we tend to lean on assumptions more than curiosity, right? And so we're not getting to know people. We're more apt to lean into this idea that because this individual belongs to a particular identity group, and I don't care what that identity is, right? It could be one based on race, one based on your sexual orientation, dot, dot, dot down the line. That we assume that we know what this person represents, how they think about things. And I would say very much so as we talk about political alliances right now, that is very real.
Right.
And so it sounds like you had a moment where your whole worldview may have shaken in that moment. And it's like, well, wait, I have to step back for a second and like really assess this. Arthur's my friend, and he doesn't fit this stereotype, as using your words, that I had before. And so I am very curious because part of it for me is it sounds like you were able to approach this more open minded because this was a trusted person, right? Someone that you had built this friendship with over the last couple of years. But again, as I'm thinking about what this means for us today in society, what would you tell other people, right, who are making assumptions about people's identity? Like, how do we move closer towards this idea of inclusion, belonging, curiosity, getting to know people for who they actually are?
Well, again, let me tell you how blessed I was and others will be if they overcome these cultural pieces and be a little bit more curious. Because again, let me explain. Not long after I had this revelation, with Arthur, again, a couple of years past, he eventually died of AIDS. I was with him the night before he passed away with his partner uh, at Sloan Kettering Hospital. Again, that's how close we were. This black guy from the Bronx, New York, and this white kid from Iowa. One played the congas and one played the cello. Arthur Russell today is famous, but listen to this. If I had not been curious and had stepped into Arthur Russell's world at his invitation, this is what I would have missed. Who did I say was in his group? There was a woman named Elodie Loughton. And one day, I'm rehearsing with Elodie on her stuff, and I happen to have my son with me. He's about 8 years old, and I got all his percussion equipment, and I'm working on an operetta with her. And who was there? This gentleman named Frank Hay Jr. He's a black man. He's classical trained. And after one of those rehearsals, he says to me, Mustafa, I'm just amazed at your ability to be totally involved in the rehearsal. And your son is engaged and very, very quiet. I'm up at a church in the Bronx, Butler United Methodist, and I'm wondering whether you'd like to come up and start a percussion ensemble for young people. 30 years later, I am still performing every Sunday morning as a member of his ministry as he's moved through churches. I mean, 35 years or more performing with him as a result of saying yes to Arthur Russell.
Yeah. I
I
love
have
that.
been, I just want to mention just one more thing,
Go ahead.
with Peter Gordon, who was also there. Peter Gordon, again, great. He's all over CBS records and albums, etc. I have been to Europe, all in the major cities, Rio de Janeiro, performing in his bands. Why? To this day, we have a performance coming up in a major nightclub in New York City as a result of meeting Arthur Russell. And so this is what I say to the audience. It's like, instead of just going through your assumptions, ask some questions, make invitations, invite other people to your world, and when they give you an invitation, take it, accept it.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's-
I absolutely adore that, because I think that the benefit of curiosity is we're not leaning into it to get something per se, but it is a natural thing that occurs because you were curious about someone. And I'll tell you, I just happened to watch the news yesterday, and Shonda Rhimes, who everybody knows because Shonda has done all the TV series in
Mhm.
the last several years, she had written a book 10 years ago called A Year of Yes. Okay.
A year of
We are
yes.
now on the 10th year anniversary, which is why she was on this news feature. But the whole premise behind A Year of Yes is saying yes to those invitations that come from people, right? Saying yes to doing things differently than you might have done it yesterday, to trying out new things. And not necessarily turning your back on it. Like many of us can be risk adverse in our lives, or we're like, oh, now is not the right time. But her idea and the premise behind it was, if it is not hurting you, right? If it is not hurting anyone else, give it a try. Just say yes.
Yes. Even if it's a
Yeah.
little uncomfortable,
E
sometimes, for
especially if
me, the
it's a little
best
bit
things that came to
uncomfortable.
me were accepting those invitations that made me feel uncomfortable. I mean,
Yeah,
wow.
yeah. I can see, like, your energy's, like, even shifting as we're talking, and it is for me, like, as I watch that and, like, I know my own experiences, when I have said yes to the things that I was kinda on the fence about or I felt a little nervous about, it has led to some of the most amazing, life-changing moments.
Yes.
And so as we think about bridging across culture, bridging across difference, like I thank you for sharing that story because I want people to see what can manifest by a simple yes.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know, we're leaning into it.
Okay. Can I give you
Uh,
another quick story? I don't know how much
oh,
time we
please
have.
do.
Now, here's a different situation where I said yes for someone else who also, again, is a white man. Uh, he is, at this particular point, probably the closest friend and supporter I have in life. And his name is Charles Campo. And here it all goes back to the music. During also the time that I was first, with James Mason and Arthur, there was all this exciting time. We were all part of what was known as the downtown music scene. It's part of the
Okay.
culture. All the folks down in the village, et cetera. And we're doing all of this experimental music where there's jazz, there's R&B, and they're infusing African and Middle Eastern music in it. Anyway, so Charles and I were, again in a regular pop band at Downtown Sound. And he sort of knew some of the things that I was doing that was a little bit off center. He grew up in Ossining, New York. So I'm a New Yorker, he's not. And so I'm like tied into all of the different little places where the musicians are going. And he says to me one day, like, yo, can I hang out? Can I hang out? Because he heard that I was actually playing at a dance class, down on 42nd Street, what was known as Theater Row. And I was like a singular drummer. And, I had all of these great dancers that were dancing, and he wanted to hang out. It was like sort of like that Herbie Man vibe, we want to hang out with the percussionists. And it's like, I'm saying to myself, yeah, I don't know whether the sisters are going to like me bringing, a white man into a black thing. Okay. And I'm saying to myself, you know what? I don't care. I don't care. Charles wants to hang out. He knows what the situation is. I'm going to see if he can hang. And so Charles comes, he brings his flute, and we sitting there rocking. I'm on the drums and he blowing the flute. And session by sessions, oh, the sisters, they just started loving Charles Campo. They just loved the sound of the flute. I would stop playing and he would play during the warm up. Charles and I became like this. after that, it was like, yeah, okay. Yeah, you did it. You came into my neighborhood and decided that you were gonna hang out and you were true to it. Your first week when they frowned at you, you kept coming and you kept playing and they loved you. And that gave me a sense of accomplishment. Again, I had something to offer someone else. Now, Charles is going on because he's a trained musician. So again, he was curious. He wanted to have something. I was curious as to whether he could hang out in this thing across cultural bounds. And it's like we both answered each other's questions.
Yeah.
Best friends today.
Yeah, and built a
Best of
solid
friends.
friendship, which I definitely appreciate. I have grown over the years, I think, as an individual because my friend circle is so diverse.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know that anybody is exactly like another person. They may have some identity traits in common, but I think the richness really comes from exposing yourself, learning about different cultures and values and just how people see the world. And like, it does not shake who I am at my core. Like, it is
Yeah.
simply that is so lovely that you do that, right? I can learn from that. I can
Yeah.
embrace it. I can say sometimes, you know what? I love that for you, but it's not for me. And the world still goes on and we're still
Yep.
really close.
And if you like to eat, Charles, of course, again, I won't say of course, but he comes from an Italian family and he's quite an
Mm,
Italian cook. And I cannot tell you the number of recipes, and meals that I've had at his home
yeah,
that I've just,
yeah,
oh, let me tell you again, if you don't ask questions, if you don't open your heart, if you're closed minded, if curiosity is not an element of your soul,
yeah.
it's a big loss. I ask everybody to try to find it, Danny. And I really appreciate what you're doing with this uh, because when I first found out about it, it was like, why no one else? Why haven't I seen anyone else really ask this question? People tend to find these things accidentally. They don't go out and look for them. And somehow or another, you seem to have found this vein where there are people uh, that you've talked about that have been curious
Yeah.
in terms of these cultural questions, and because they've asked questions, you know, their
What
lives
I
have been enriched.
Yeah, what I'm learning from this experience is like I started this podcast because I didn't hear enough people in my mind, in my world, talking about it. But it was always something that I was interested in since I was a kid. And I figured I could start the conversation. But one of the biggest gifts back to me in this process is that my network of people who I know are having deep conversations and in different ways. Some of them are focused on specific countries, others are focused on ideologies, just so many different perspectives, but it makes my life richer because we're all really curious in similar ways, although the topics shift. And I'm like, I love talking to people, learning from them, being able to share, quite frankly, honest conversations, because I know as we sit here, like not every episode is going to be sounding perfectly polished and professional, and there's a reason for it. I want people to
Mhm.
come feel like they are sitting at the kitchen table with me and we are just chatting. I want it to
Right,
feel like
right.
we are in community together because I think that is something that the world is really missing right now. And so I want to add my own little dose of that, if you will. Say yes to that.
Yes.
Um so I want to ask you a couple of last questions before we
Okay.
wrap. And part of this is I know that you also traveled and lived in Tanzania.
Yes.
And, so this is it's a Black nation, but so
Yes.
drastically different from how we view Blackness in America. And I'm wondering, like, again, what that experience taught you about belonging and even having to adapt while you were there in Tanzania.
Well, the Tanzanian experience actually occurred right between the time I decided, well, I had the opportunity to go to Tanzania and my professional work experience. Uh, Again, I was a college, activist. I was head of the Black Student Union at New York University, at this time, 1970, 1971. And there was an opportunity through something coming out of Riverside Church called Pan African Skills, which was very similar to a Black Peace Corps, Black Community Peace Corps. And so Julius Nyerere was the Catholic president of Tanzania at a time when there was this kind of revolutionary theory going on in East Africa. You had Idi Amin and Jomo Kenyatta, okay, in Kenya, and Idi Amin in Uganda. And so, again, believe it or not, I sign up, I get selected to go for what would have been up to 6 months to work on what was, again, here's again a cultural, an Ujamaa village. The Ujamaa village was actually built upon the Israeli kibbutz system. Cooperative economics, people, all work together for one particular outcome. The funny thing is that the project that I was selected for, the project that was available to me, was teaching people in this area of Dar es Salaam, the capital, little town called Kurasini, uh, how to raise chickens. Here's a boy from the Bronx. I didn't know piddly squat about raising chickens. I wasn't from down south, but here I am in Dar es Salaam. I get there, and again, I'm taught how to be part of the process of teaching people how to raise, build chicken pens. We had these long chicken pens, and, which eggs we would pick and so forth and so on and so forth, to actually butchering them and serving them up, that whole process. Unbelievable. And again, the most amazing thing that I found, and again, you have to understand, is that, again, and when we talk about 1969, 1970, 1971, I was still in this, when the revolution comes, blow the MF up, okay? It's like, bingo,
Sure.
it's all nihilism. I'm walking around with paratrooper boots and, the 55 millimeter bullet, on my chest, the black beret, that whole thing. I get off the plane in Tanzania, in Dar es Salaam, and it's like, everybody, every job, they're Black. Not like in New York where Black people had some jobs and the white people had all the other jobs. It's like everything. Damn, Mustafa, when we win the revolution, how are we going to run the cities? How are we going to do this? How are we going to do it? Once again, just completely, I had no idea how I was going to succeed on a chicken farm, but because I was curious to find that out, I got an answer to a bigger question. Well, once you win the revolution, what the heck are you going to do? I ended up leaving Dar es Salaam a little bit earlier because, I couldn't take the quinine tablets, for the whatever that thing is. I forget that you get really sick. Okay. And so I went to, I took a 700-mile train ride, and I went to Nairobi for the OAU, the Organization of African Unity, first All African Trade Fair. And so I see all of these different countries. It's like the World's Fair of Africa. And that was the environment, again, because I had that question. I then have some more questions like, well, what are we going to do when we win the revolution? It brings me back to Iris Noble and looking for that first job. Again, a lot of people would not have left the comforts of New York University and go to some place like Dar es Salaam, which is all the way on the other side of Africa. We're not talking about Nigeria. Okay. We're not talking about where it was safe. We're talking about where uh, it was considered to be a revolutionary place. And in fact, I lived in the same complex where H. Rap Brown lived, at the same complex. He left a couple of weeks before I got there. Again, just seeing, these ideas that, I'm fantasizing as an African American about what Africa is. Uh,
Mm,
and then again, because it's like I'm curious. Oh, I'm gonna go. And to find out that they're not all playing drums and they're not all with all of this cultural stuff that we think, but they're actually running governments and cities and so forth and so on. Uh, Again, it
yeah.
lent some balance. It gave me a context for the work that I would do the rest of my life.
Hmm. I have such mixed emotions as I hear you talk about that. And part of that stems from our educational system here in the US and what we are intentionally exposed to. Right? So this idea that again, Africans look a certain way, they live in huts, they
Yes,
sleep on the floor, and all the depictions. Like I grew up at a time, particularly in the 80s, where famine was a very real issue in a lot of the African nations. And so my first exposure was to children on these like World Aid commercials where they had bloated bellies because they were starving. Right. And so this is the depiction that I get of this entire continent and this people of which I come from, but I feel incredibly disconnected. And it wasn't until I chose to, because even as I'm going through school, didn't have much exposure to what other things look like, right? I had to rely on my parents. My mom made me do book reports every year over the summer just because she thought it was fun. I did not at the time, but I am grateful
yes,
today. Um, and me wanting to travel the world to be able to see people, but now more importantly, actually talk to folks that come from these places. So, like, I have some good friends that are from Kenya and um Nigeria, and like we talk about like what if I am to visit your homeland, what are the things I absolutely have to do? Tell me a little bit about like the economy there. What does
right,
this actually look like? And so I think again, why I have mixed emotions about this is I think it's so beautiful when we can arrive someplace. And I know you're talking specifically about like the African continent, but I've had the same experience everywhere that I travel.
yeah.
I chose to go a couple of years ago, this was before the pandemic, to India as a solo trip.
Wow.
And it was the first time I actually went anywhere as an adult on my own and like I'm flying across the globe. But what was really it stood out to me is when I was getting ready to go on the trip, I actually did ask other people if they wanted to come with me. And the response is like, well, why would you want to go there? It's dirty, it's impoverished. And I'm like, have you been? And they were like, "Well, no, but I know that to be true." And I was like, Tell me again what you know after you've gone." My
Yes.
experience there was so wonderful. The people were wonderful. The culture was wonderful. And yes, there is poverty, but last I checked, there's also poverty right here at home. Right? Like,
Oh, indeedy, Bob.
and so like as we're thinking about that, like I don't want to just go off of the assumption. I want to really have the experience and then I can make sense of it.
Yes.
So I
Yes.
I love that you shared that.
Yes.
Um So, all right, I'm going to ask you one final big question because you
Mhm.
referenced at the top of our call African Bambaataa. And so, for folks who are not familiar, because not everybody's going to be familiar, I grew up during that era where that was a big deal for us. Tell us a little bit about who Africa Bambaataa is and the type of work that you did together.
Well, this is important. Africa Bambaataa was one of in his group, uh, the Zulu, the Zulu Nation, was one of the preeminent hip hop groups at the dawning of the age of hip hop in American culture. He came out of the Bronx. Now, I want to be clear. This is very important. I did not work with Bambaataa in our music capacity. I have nothing specific to do with any of his success in music. I want to make that clear. This is the story. When I met him, he was Lance Taylor. Lance Taylor was a gang banger. He was one of the major forces in the Black Spades, that street gang, the violent street gang when I got my first job working for the city, as I had mentioned before, as a youth street gang worker. And for a period of time, I was assigned to one of the local projects to be a counselor. This is when I was with the Bronx Youth Service System. And he at that time was one of the teen leaders. He was very well respected. He was quite articulate. And, he was spinning records and so forth and so on. And because of the nature of the street gangs, not just in our immediate area, but other places, the community center assigned me because we had a van. My program had a van, and I was the one who was responsible for the van. And I was responsible for taking him and his crew to various locations where they would set up, their turntables and whatever and spin records. Uh, he was a very impressive young man. And because of feedback that I had about how he was respected when he would go out, and because of just what he did in the neighborhood, he was selected for something known as the UNICEF program that my
Okay.
wife at the time was in charge of. She was the social worker on the scene, and she selected him for that. And that particular year, the UNICEF program sent him to West Africa. And that basically, again, blew this young man's mind. And so Lance Taylor has that experience, and he comes back and he changes, like many young men, including myself, at those ages and times. Essentially, we changed our names. We wanted to have names that identified with the African experience and heritage. Uh, and so he became Africa Bambaataa. And his keyboard player, and I actually, again, totally coincidentally, Leroy Evans, who has a big studio in New York City these days, was his keyboard player. So there was always this kind of close relationship, even though I didn't do any music with him. But to this day, you read any interviews of Bambaataa. Now, he's had some troubles in his later life. Certain issues have come up, which I'm not going to get into. But, he'll tell anybody, wow, Mustafa Ahmed and what he did for me, as a youth gang worker and a counselor, made a big difference in his life. So,
Yeah, thank you for sharing that story.
yeah.
Um, so I'm just curious, like again, as we get ready to close this call, is there anything that you want to leave listeners with today? Like any last takeaways?
America was and is a country with great people who have come from many, many different parts of the world and have many, many different stories to tell. Right now, I would say I think that we're in a bit of trouble because those things, those curiosities, there's a reason why people left Europe. They wanted to come here. They wanted to find out what the American experience was about. They were curious. The African slaves who had the chance to leave and go back to Africa decided, no, we're going to stay. We're going to struggle. We want to find out what this experience is about. I'm going to ask my friends, I will say my big story is keep that in mind. Let's keep thinking about each other. Let's keep trying to draw closer to each other. Think about the things that culturally bring us together in these times where it seems that the government, for some inexplicable reason, wants to bring us apart. That's
Okay.
my prayer for
I,
America and our
I
community.
I thank you for that. And I think that's a good place for us to close. Now, Mustafa, if people want to get in touch with you, what is the best way for them to reach out to you?
Well, I do have email. Well, I have a Facebook page. It's public that has all my contact information. Mustafa Khalik Ahmed Okay, it's right there. You can Google me, Mustafa Khalik Ahmed, American musician. You'll find it all there. So again, I have to tell you, at 73, most of my time is behind me. The future is yours. And so if I can share any information, provide any resources, folks do contact me. I'll give you the juice. You carry on the struggle. La luta
I
continua. The struggle continues.
Indeed, indeed. Mustafa, thank you so much. I really, really appreciated the time today. Thank you so
Thank you,
much. Take
Danielle. I
care.
truly appreciate it. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Absolutely. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with your network. It makes a big difference in helping us grow this community. And if you're looking for coaching or resources to take your cultural awareness to the next level, visit us at culture-principles.com/coaching. And remember, where curiosity leads, connection follows. Be well.